Hey everybody, welcome back to Football Talk with Vinny. And in today's video, we're going to continue the 8-part series going over what teams should do in the offseason. Now again, we're doing it division by division. So now we're going to start in the AFC. So this is essentially going to be the 5th video. This one actually might be the longest one, as you can tell by the title. We're going over the AFC East. Now the reason why this one may be the longest is because most of these teams are going to have a ton of options and a ton of things they could do. You have teams in this division specifically that are in the top 5 to 10 in cap space, and you got teams like the Jets and the Patriots, which were number 2 and number 3 respectively, and then the Dolphins, I believe, are 10th in amount of cap space available. So with having cap space, again, if you've seen some of the other videos, most teams, especially since due to COVID, the cap is actually way down. Most teams don't have any money, so most teams don't have much they can do to improve their team other than draft. But this division is going to be a little different. So let's get right into it. So we're going to get right into it with probably the most boring team of the 4, which is the Buffalo Bills. And obviously not because of their team, just because of what they can or maybe can't do this offseason. So for the Buffalo Bills right now, according to overthecap.com, they are about minus $1 million over the cap. So again, they're right at zero pretty much. And when you look at their roster, there's not many moves they can make in terms of cutting guys to create cap space. Most of their guys are either really good players and you're never going to cut them, or they either have deals to where if you cut them, you actually have to pay them more. So obviously you're not going to do something like that because the whole point of cutting a guy is so you can create cap space to sign another player. Really looking at the roster, Mario Addison was the only guy that I saw that they maybe could cut. And again, I believe he only saves about $4 or $5 million with that move, so pretty insignificant in terms of being able to sign any other free agent player. So again, if you're Buffalo, you pretty much are only going to have to improve through the draft. And again, as with most teams that I kind of went over in the AFC portion of the video, that's really where most teams are at with the cap going down. Now, obviously, if you're Buffalo, it kind of sucks, right? Because if the cap didn't go down and you're at zero now, you would technically be about 20 to 30 million in cap space. You'd have a realistic shot of signing a bunch of players and maybe going kind of all in before you have to give Josh Allen his big money. Which kind of segues great to my next point, which is maybe the most important part of this offseason. It's not really much about improving. It's more about handling Josh Allen. Now, if you're Buffalo, I really don't see a way that you don't give him an extension, right? If you're either a fan of the Buffalo Bills or you just follow football, you've noticed that over the last 20 plus years, they've had terrible time finding a quarterback. They've went through dozens of quarterbacks and none of them have worked out. So when you find one like Josh Allen, it's kind of tough to tell anyone in the Bills organization not to give him his money. Right, and then it leads into the whole thing, do you want to give him his money 2 years early, right? He has this year left on his deal, and then because he was a first-round pick, he is going to have that 5th-year option, which of course you're going to pick up if you're the Bills. So do you want to give him his money 2 years early? Now, obviously, it can go one of two ways, right? You saw a couple years back, the Philadelphia Eagles and also the Rams gave Jared Goff and Carson Wentz their big money, while Dallas did not give it to Dak, right? Because they were all drafted that same year, whereas it looked initially like a good investment for both the Philadelphia Eagles and the Los Angeles Rams, but after the 2 years, both regressed significantly, of course, and all of a sudden, now within the last 2 weeks, neither quarterback are on that roster anymore. So both have been traded over the last 2 weeks. Which does bring up a good point, and I'll probably get to it in a later video. Don't want this video to be too long. It's already going to be long enough, but do you want to pay Josh Allen, or do you want to maybe wait these year or two just to see if he can repeat the success he had this year? Because I believe he had the biggest jump in completion percentage from one year to the next of any quarterback in NFL history. So that is such a crazy number that do you want to maybe just go into this offseason and go into the season and see what he does this year and maybe his 5th-year option before giving him that big money? Because when you give Josh Allen his money, it's going to be along the lines of $250,000, right? You're going to have to give him something along the lines of $40+ million for 4 or 5 years. So that is a pretty significant investment. And, you know, if he does regress over the next year or two, right, you might want to factor that into the money you give him. Whereas if you give it to him now, you know, if he does regress, you're kind of still stuck. But again, after the year he had, you really, you don't really foresee him going back to playing really bad. He may come back down a little bit because he did have such a great year, or this may just be the new norm, so you never know. That's the difficult part before you give guys contracts. So again, we'll just get into the draft because again, after signing Josh Allen, there's not much you can do in free agency. So as far as the draft is concerned, I think if you're Buffalo, obviously you're going to be picking towards the end. I think maybe an offense or a defensive lineman, right? Either A, shore up the offensive line to make holes for some of the running backs, or obviously Josh Allen as well, or maybe shore up that D line so you can start to get after the passer. Because when you look at the Buffalo Bills as a roster, they're pretty complete, right? Obviously they have a very good offense. They win most games offensively, but they have a lot of talent on the defensive side of the football. And I think primarily the talent is actually in the back end, right? You got guys like Tre'Davious White, Micah Hyde, some guys have made some Pro Bowls before. Your linebacking core is pretty good with Matt Milano and Edmonds. So you have a pretty good back end. You obviously need to shore up the front seven. Now you do have Ed Oliver, who you took in the first round 2 years ago, and hopefully he continues to progress and get better. But I think if you're Buffalo, you can add to that D-line depth. Obviously, it's tough because you can't really sign anyone in free agency, but if you can draft a player that can come in and get you some pressures and some sacks, I think that would be great. Obviously, if you saw the AFC Championship game, they weren't really able to get after him as much, and when they were, Patrick Mahomes was able to escape, like, unfortunately he does to most teams, but he was able to escape, and then that back end kind of broke down. But yeah, I really think there's not much, again, that Buffalo can do, so let's get into the more exciting teams. So we're going to start off with the Dolphins. The Dolphins actually have $23 million to spend, so pretty significant considering most of the other teams that I've already went over. I think obviously the biggest move this offseason is going to be, do they get Deshaun Watson, right? And I think that's the biggest factor, because if you get Deshaun Watson, obviously what you're going to have to give up may kind of restrict the rest of your offseason, right? If you have to, for example, give up Tua and both your first round picks this year and maybe a first rounder next year, right? You have to give up 3 firsts and Tua. Now, not only do you have to give up 3 firsts and Tua, so now your draft capital goes significantly down, but to bring in Deshaun Watson is another $10.5 million hit to your cap. Again, if you have $23 million, now you're looking at having only about 12, which you're right at the spot where once you sign some of your first round picks, you only really have enough to bring in maybe a bottom tier free agent. So of course, if you get Deshaun, it's pretty much that's your entire offseason is getting Deshaun. Again, if I was the Miami Dolphins, I would trade the cap space and the 2 first-round picks and to get a guy like Deshaun Watson, because again, with that elite defense that you have, you bring in Deshaun Watson and all of a sudden you're on par with the Buffalo Bills in terms of competing for a championship and being one of the top 5-6 teams in the AFC. Now, if you decide to maybe not give up all those assets for Deshaun Watson, or the Texans are legitimate and they're actually not interested in trading, or they find a different trade partner that's able to offer more, you do have a couple options you can go. So as far as free agency is concerned, if I was the Dolphins, I would use some of that cap space to sign a top-tier wide receiver, maybe a guy like Chris Godwin if he does hit the free agent market, or Allen Robinson, or Kenny Golladay. Right, to me, I want to give another weapon opposite of Devontae Parker to help Tua kind of grow. To me, even if you're a good quarterback, you're only as good as the offense around you. That's why there's 11 guys. So to me, if you can give Tua another weapon, right, you're now better able to judge if he is the quarterback moving forward. And I know nowadays teams don't give the quarterbacks 4 or 5 years to grow and develop. If you don't see significant development in year 2 or 3, you're ready to cut him, aka Baker Mayfield, right? He kind of struggled the last 2-ish seasons, and they were ready to cut him kind of mid-season. There was kind of thoughts of, do you want to give Baker an extension, and all this free agency talk of like maybe cutting him or finding a different guy. So a lot of times we just don't give quarterbacks the time to kind of develop nowadays. So I think if you're going to try to help in that development process, you do want to get another weapon that he's able to maybe find more success by having more weapons on the outside. It obviously will improve your running game if you sign a guy like Allen Robinson, because now you have 2 legit threats on the outside, and it's tough to really defend them both while stacking 7, 8 in the box to stop the run. As far as the draft goes, obviously they're picking really high, so I think a lot of mock drafts have him actually taking a wide receiver like Jamar Chase or Devontae Smith, right? Or maybe addressing the offensive line with their second pick as well. Now, obviously, to me, if you're the Miami Dolphins, if you're able to maybe sign a guy like Kenny Golladay or Allen Robinson in free agency, you can now use that third pick to maybe take a guy like Penei Sewell, right? Because I think a lot of people think that the Jets are either going to A, take the quarterback or trade down, because that's a good trade down spot. And whoever trades up to number 2 is probably going to take Zach Wilson. So if you're the Dolphins at number 3, you legitimately could take the best tackle in this draft, or, second best, depending on who you talk to. You could take one of the top tackles in this draft, and now you kind of solidify your offensive line. You used free agencies to solidify the wide receiving core, and now you have the makings of a very good offense to go along with that top-notch defense. And again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them maybe trying to address the offensive line in free agency, right? And taking a guy like Jamar Chase or Devontae Smith with the number 3 pick, right? Either way kind of works out. That's why with the Dolphins, you have so many options for you. But obviously, I think Deshaun Watson is the first one that needs to be covered, because if you have to give up all your picks, right? And obviously it will take up some cap space to get him. It kind of, restricts what you could do in free agency. But then again, I think if you're from Miami, you really wouldn't care if you get Deshaun. Next, we're going to go over the New England Patriots. Now, the Patriots are in a very weird spot where they have significant cap space. They are the number 3 team. They have $61 million of cap space. Obviously, on the defensive side of the ball, they had a lot of guys opt out for this COVID season, so they're all going to opt back in, of course, right? So your defense should be pretty solid this offseason. You don't really need to use much of that cap space to address it. I think you would be able to quickly compete for a playoff spot if you use some of that money to address the offensive side of the ball. Now, obviously, you have some guys on your roster that are going to be free agents that you're going to want to sign. Joe Thuney, McCourty, and then also J.C. Jackson, the other corner, who did play a lot of snaps and played very well for the New England Patriots this season. So I think that's probably going to take up a lot of your cap space, right? You're talking paying a top cornerback $13-14 million, right? So even if J.C. Jackson doesn't get that kind of money, maybe he gets 10. Devin McCourty, maybe he gets 10, right? And then Joe Thuney, the guard, he may get close to 10 as well. So now you're talking about only having 35-ish million, which is still significant cap space, but at least you kind of re-sign a couple of your guys. And then actually kind of like Miami, if you're New England, you definitely use some of that cap space to bring in 1 or 2 of those wide receivers, right? If you're New England and you can bring in a guy like Allen Robinson and Kenny Golladay, or maybe Kenny Golladay and T.Y. Hilton, right? If you could bring in 1 or 2 of those wide receiving options, all of a sudden, you now go from having almost no weapons to having a bunch of weapons, because now N'Keal Harry will be your number 3, which, again, if he can take a couple steps forward from his year 2 to year 3 and be a little better, that's a pretty good number 3 wide receiver option. Obviously, you're going to have to address the quarterback position. In terms of free agency, there's not much there you can really do realistically. So I guess, at that point, it's going to be, is New England going to trade up in the draft and draft a quarterback? Or are you going to maybe try to sign a veteran quarterback, maybe like an Andy Dalton, and just kind of move forward with him and kind of see if you could make the playoffs with that guy? But if you're New England, you won, I believe it was 7 games this year, maybe 6 games. Right, and that was with a bunch of guys on the defensive side opting out, and obviously you were in a bad spot with Brady leaving, you having a huge dead cap number because Brady left. So I think now with all the money that you're freed up, if you just sign a couple guys on the offensive side of the ball and get a stable quarterback to kind of be able to make some plays when they're there, I think with that defense, which should still be pretty good this year, you can easily see New England being in the playoff hunt next year. I guess the other offseason thing that we should talk about is, are they going to trade Stephon Gilmore? So there's been some rumors about it. And I guess it kind of makes sense. He is starting to get a little older, right? He's not going to play at the elite level for too much longer. And obviously it's the Bill Belichick way. You'd rather trade a player a year early rather than a year late, right? So if they're able to trade Stephon Gilmore, right, again, he's still playing at an elite level. So could you potentially get a first-round pick or more for a guy like Stephon Gilmore? And if you can, would you rather do that and free up a bunch of that money, right? Would you rather free up a bunch of money, or would you rather, go into this season and say, you know what, we're going to keep Stephon Gilmore and we're going to just going to try to compete? Now, obviously, there's 2 things at play. I think Bill Belichick's like 68, 69. I don't think he wants to do like a full rebuild. I don't think he's going to want to coach for too much longer. So if you're Bill, you maybe just say, you know what, we're going to keep Stephon Gilmore and just try with the cap space you have and the draft capital to compete for a championship this year, right? Because if you're Bill Belichick, that might be what you're thinking about, is the near future and the now rather than 4 or 5 years from now. Obviously, if you're talking about the draft, right, a guy like Mac Jones has been mocked for a bunch, right? Because, again, if you're New England, you're going to have to trade up a bunch of spots to take one of the top-end quarterbacks, because they're probably all going to be gone by the top 6, 7 picks. So you're going to have to trade up significantly to get a quarterback that's maybe not Mac Jones. And a lot of mock drafts now are having Mac Jones go in the top 10 as well. So then lastly, we'll talk about the New York Jets. They actually have the second most cap space in the NFL at $67 million. Obviously, when you decide to tear it down and go into like a full rebuild mode, that's why you have so much cap space. Now, obviously, if you're the Jets, it's kind of similar to Miami, right? If you get Deshaun Watson, what do you have to give up for him? If you give up a lot for him, you're kind of limited in what you can do. Not as limited as the Miami Dolphins would be, because again, with $67 million in cap space, if you bring on a guy like Deshaun Watson and have to pay him $10.5 million, you still have $50+ million to spend. So you're still able to improve your roster through free agency and then obviously your lower draft picks. So now we'll get into, obviously, if you trade for Deshaun Watson first, right? Obviously, it makes too much sense if you trade Deshaun. Let's say if you have to give up, let's say a guy like Sam Darnold and your 2 first-round picks this year, maybe 1 first-round pick next year. We'll just use that kind of just as the basis. So if that's what you have to give up, now obviously if you bring in a guy like Deshaun Watson, I think the number one goal is to surround him with some talent. So I think, again, kind of like Miami and also New England, right? You use that cap space to bring in a guy like Chris Godwin or Allen Robinson or Kenny Golladay or T.Y. Hilton or Marvin Jones, right? And really, if you're the Jets, you want to bring in at least 2 of those guys. Because again, you want to be able, if you don't have a first-round pick, right, if you trade them both, you want to be able to put enough guys around Deshaun Watson to where he can be successful. Even though the Texans organization wasn't the best, he still had weapons around him, even though he lost D-Hop. He had Brandon Cooks, he had Fuller, he had Kenny Stills. He had some weapons, which is why he was able to still be successful, because he's a good quarterback. If you're Deshaun Watson and you go to the New York Jets, if they don't sign a wide receiver or 2, it's still going to be tough to be good, even though you're an elite player. If your receivers aren't getting open, and when they are, they're not catching the ball, right? It's tougher to have and put up the big stats. Whereas if you sign a guy like Allen Robinson, for example, and a Marvin Jones, let's say you sign both of those guys, now he can pair with Jamison Crowder and Denzel Mims, your second round pick, the year prior. You now have a bunch of receivers that can all get open on any corner that they're on, so they can maybe potentially beat some of their one-on-one matchups. And if you got a guy like Deshaun, he can put the ball where it needs to go. Now, if you don't end up trading for Deshaun Watson, you still have actually 2 other options you can go with, right? Do you stick with Sam Darnold, or do you draft a quarterback with the number 2 pick? So again, we're going to have to address those differently. If you decide to stick with Sam Darnold, then again, I still think you kind of want to sign some wide receivers, right? Because again, you want to give your team and your general manager and your organization the chance to really evaluate Sam Darnold fairly, right? And if you add some wide receivers, you're able to fairly assess if Sam Darnold is the guy moving forward. Is he the guy you want to give a big contract to? So I think signing some wide receivers is still the way to go if I'm the New York Jets. And then in the draft, normally if I'm the Jets, I would probably use the number 2 pick to trade down, because if there's teams willing to give up multiple first-round picks to move up to number 2 to take Zach Wilson, I would rather take the extra draft capital, and try to build my team out that way. Now, if you don't get many great offers, then you're stuck at number 2, and again, you don't want the quarterback, I would take the tackle, Penei Sewell, right? Again, even though you took Mekhi Becton, I would rather have better offensive line play and use free agency to sign some wide receivers rather than go the reverse route and take the best wide receiver at number 2 and sign some offensive linemen. I know offensive line play is really not a sexy pick, but it is the pick that helps both your run and your pass game. Whereas a wide receiver, of course, does help your running game a little bit if he's dynamic enough and you draw double coverage. Of course, they're going to take some away from defending the run, but when you have great offensive line play up front, it's easier for the skill positions to shine. So yeah, if I was the Jets, that would definitely be the route that I would take. Now, obviously, if you do end up going that route, you sign some wide receivers and you take a tackle with your first pick. Now, with the second pick, I'm probably trying to go somewhere along the lines on the defensive side of the ball, maybe another edge rusher or a corner, depending on who falls in the draft and who do you think you have higher on your draft board. But any player you can get on the defensive side, I think that could help maybe get some stops, not put as much pressure on your offense to have to score a bunch of points to win some ball games. And then, like I said, this may be the longest video because of so many options you have. If you're the Jets and you decide to take Zach Wilson, now it opens up some more stuff. I still think signing some wide receivers in the free agency market is still the best choice, because even if you're going to bring in a young guy like Zach Wilson, you want him to be able to succeed. You don't want to put him in the same situation. Really, you put Sam Darnold in the last 3 years, which is not much talent around you. It's kind of tough to succeed. So I still think you want to go the wide receiver route in free agency. Now, if you take Zach Wilson, what do you get for Sam Darnold? Let's say you get a 2, right? Because, I mean, I think if Carson Wentz can go for a 2 and almost a 3 and a 2 and potentially a 1, I think you can get a 2 for Sam Darnold, if not even more. So now if you're able to get a 2 for Sam Darnold, right, you take Zach Wilson with your first pick. I think the second pick, again, if you decide not to take, obviously, Penei Sewell because you take the quarterback, I think now taking tackle makes more sense with your second pick because now you want, again, to put a great offensive line behind Zach Wilson. And if you sign some wide receivers in free agency, you don't have as much of a need to try to get some skill position players. So now, to me, with my second pick, I try to go tackle. And then if you're able to get a second-round pick this year for Sam Darnold, now you have 2 seconds this year that you can kind of use to maybe address the defensive side of the football. Okay, so that's going to be it for the video. Like I said, it's probably going to be the longest one just because, again, all 3 teams are in the top 10 in cap space, and you got the Jets and the Patriots that are in the top 3 in cap space, 2 and 3 respectively, right? So when you have teams like that that have so many different options that they can go, and of course for both teams with the Dolphins and the Jets, both able to trade for Deshaun Watson, which it significantly decides kind of which direction you should go in free agency. There's a lot of options there, so of course that's why the video should be the longest. But if you guys stuck along this far, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button, also subscribe, and thank you guys so much for watching, and I look forward to putting out the other 3 videos. Thank you.